Yo, what up? Josh Ruben from East West Sailing and Performance. Today I want to talk about optimizing respiration. And of course, most of this information is taken from Peat's article or newsletter on respiration, cellular respiration, hyperventilation, and breathing that was put out in March of 2009. At the same time, this might be a two-part, for sure, a three-part series, because I want to go into many different facets, as well as at the end talk about how to things that you can do to optimize respiration. Now, at the same time, most of this information is actually taken directly from one of the documents, or one of the many documents that's in our Metabolic Blueprint program. So just keep that in mind. I have many pages of notes right here, which I'm going to constantly refer to. There's a lot of information. Right now I'm feeling a little overworked and under-rested, so in order to support that beside food, I'm going to refer to my notes. That's just how it's going to be. So what is respiration? Now we can think about respiration at the cell level and at the physiological level, like breathing. But it doesn't matter, because cellular respiration, or respiration per se, breathing in a general sense, is actually the exchange of oxygen and nutrients between the person, the cell, and their environment. So it's that exchange, and we want that actual balance when this is going on at the cellular level. Now there's many things that actually can affect this. There's many things that are actually mitochondrial poisons, things that affect how much carbon dioxide is produced, how oxygen is used, how glucose is used, how it's not used, and how we overproduce lactic acid and produce free fatty acids, and we're not producing optimal energy. And I want to go into all these things, not in depth, but to a sense you have some understanding of possibly what's going on at the cell level. What is a cellular poison, in a sense, which in 1926 Otto Warburg actually showed that carbon monoxide that was stimulated from hemoxygenase, which is stimulated from estrogen, actually cause an oxygen deficit at the cell level, but carbon monoxide is a cellular poison. And as Peat says, unsaturated fats are mitochondrial poisons. So we're going to talk about all these things. Now, in this day and age, most people are taking antioxidants, and we can think about respiration in correlation with antioxidants. Now, I'm not here to pick on anyone. I'm not tuning in on anything or anyone or any particular antioxidant. I'm just giving you my approach. I like to get people away from supplements as much as possible. Now, of course, if someone's going through a mercury detox, or they have cancer, AIDS, and they need some sort of antioxidant support at the right time, definitely not opposed to it, because it can actually have a huge benefit in high doses if you use the right one. But 99% of the time, most people don't need them. For me, you're living a this for that approach. You're using antioxidants because things in your life, the foods you eat, are pro-oxidative. So you actually have to take something to reduce the pro-oxidative effects of what you're doing in your life. So what if we actually reduced the pro-oxidative things, all these things I'm actually going to go through, and ate foods that were actually antioxidants? Don't you think we wouldn't have to take a lot of these crappy supplements when, in a nutshell, most of them are just making money off you and really doing no benefit, because all the pro-oxidative things in your life, those antioxidants cannot outweigh. They're not going to regulate cell metabolism. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to regulate the exchange of gases between your cells and your environment. Eat the crappy foods you want to eat, even if it's foods that are high in PUFAs. Take these antioxidants, still take your body temperature and pulse. You're not going to see an increase in body temperature and pulse, which actually means an increase in cellular metabolism. So they really don't do their job based on what antioxidants are actually supposed to do. So optimizing respiration means increasing the use of oxygen at the cell level to provide energy to the cells through oxidative phosphorylation and increase cellular capacity, increase CO2. That's what an antioxidant is supposed to do. So do an experiment. Still eat all the foods if you like foods with unsaturated fats, foods with higher in cellulose, nuts, seeds, above ground vegetables, oils, all these things that I talk about that we shouldn't eat. Take your antioxidants, and if they don't increase your body temperature and pulse, they're really not doing the job they're supposed to, because they're supposed to optimize cellular respiration, increasing the use of oxygen at the cell level, and I've talked about this, through the mitochondria, so we can produce carbon dioxide to increase the functional capacity of how our cells breathe, increasing carbon dioxide, ATP, and water, which is pure energy. And if we increase that, and I'll talk about how, we actually get an increase in body temperature and pulse, especially body temperature. And if you're not, antioxidants are not doing their job. Now, some quotes by Peat, which I find interesting, and we'll talk about this more later on in the second or third YouTube, so stay tuned. If you're bored, skip to the next one. If you're bored, skip to the third one. If you're completely bored, then just shut it off. I do this for my own pleasure and own understanding and own education, and to share this with you. So if you're bored, so be it. I love this shit. That's just how it goes. According to Ray Peat, in general, things which are associated with energy-producing respiration, such as thyroid, coconut oil, and carbon dioxide, all have their roles as antioxidants. So what if we ate the right foods and macronutrients in ratios and grams to meet our metabolic needs, to upregulate T3, to upregulate thyroid production, which is an antioxidant because it increases carbon dioxide production, and eliminated the things in our diet that actually inhibited its production? What if we use coconut oil in our diet, which is a saturated fat, which reduces our need for vitamin E, and eliminate unsaturated fats, which do many things: increase lipid peroxidation, decrease glucose oxidation, decrease T3, increase reverse T3, they're immunosuppressive, they waste vitamin E. All these things cause oxygen deprivation, where coconut oil does the opposite. And what if we did things in our life, from food, sleep, other types of nutrients and supplements, to increase carbon dioxide production at the cell level? And in a sense, these foods can be antioxidants. That's what he's basically saying. If we eat the right foods to upregulate metabolism, we don't need to take supplements. We don't need to take antioxidants. So in a sense, coconut oil, saturated fats, non-inflammatory proteins, fruits that have sucrose, below ground vegetables that have antibacterial, antifungal properties, sucrose in them, and they're lower in PUFAs, getting rid of nut and seed oils and nuts and seeds and fatty fishes, all these things which inhibit and cause peroxidation. We can actually use food as our own antioxidant, and you don't need to spend all this money on fancy antioxidants. And another quote by Ray Peat: the biological value of antioxidants is that they allow oxygen to be used productively rather than destructively. And you see that in cancer cells. They're overusing oxygen and glucose, but they're actually still producing lactic acid, even in the presence of O2 and even in the presence of glucose. So foods or antioxidants are supposed to regulate that, so we produce carbon dioxide. And with my clients that are taking antioxidants, I have never seen an antioxidant alone, the supplement, actually regulate cell metabolism and allow oxygen to be used productively at the cell level. And with that, you'll see an increase of body temperature, because you increase T3, which is revving up the engine, you increase carbon dioxide. So in a sense, they're really not doing their job. So beside antioxidants as being cellular poisons, what are some of the things in our life or in our foods that are actually cellular poisons? Things that actually poison the cell so we don't produce energy. Things that cause an oxygen deficiency. First is lack of oxygen at the cell level, of course. Lack of oxygen at the cell level causes our cells to produce lactic acid. Lactic acid is not only a cellular poison, but it actually causes the liver to use up stored glycogen, if there actually is any stored glycogen, to try to overproduce it into glucose. The problem is it overproduces into lactic acid. At the same time, anytime your cells are producing lactic acid, they're typically taking up calcium, they're typically taking up estrogen, and in a nutshell, this pushes your cells towards producing excess lactic acid as well. It pushes them into that area. So if there's not enough glycogen stored in the liver, which most people don't have, that's why they have to eat frequently to regulate their body temperature pulse, initially to regulate their physiology, because they can't store it. This is why people have trouble falling asleep or have trouble staying asleep, because the body's not storing enough glycogen. When this happens, the body starts to break down its own tissues. It releases adrenaline, I've talked about this before. It releases cortisol, I talked about this before, to mobilize stored glucose or glycogen from the muscles, mostly in the liver, as well as break down proteins and fats for energy, because we're not getting them in and we're not storing them. But the body breaks tissues down, and most people's diets are high in unsaturated fat. They get stored in the tissue. You waste vitamin E, which creates an oxygen deficit in the tissues and at the cell level, just like estrogen. Vitamin E is antagonistic to estrogen. I've talked about this. So as you break down your muscle tissues, you increase free fatty acids into the blood. Free fatty acids, according to P.J. Randall, I forget the date, it was early 1900s. He showed all the hallmark signs of diabetes are not a glucose excess. They're actually a fructose deficiency at the cell level. It's increased lipid peroxidation, increased use of free fatty acids for energy, which is not efficient. It wastes energy and doesn't produce enough. The decrease in glucose oxidation, which is a decrease in how our cells use glucose at the cell level, so they're not getting it in. So we're using free fatty acids, which basically downregulates energy production and increases lactic acid production. So it's lactic acid, the first thing that can actually be a cellular poison. And according to Ray Peat, quoting him directly, we know that glucose can be metabolized into pyruvic acid, which, in the presence of oxygen, can be metabolized into carbon dioxide, which is energy. Without oxygen, pyruvic acid can be converted into lactic acid. So if we don't have enough oxygen, we produce lactic acid. This is why Ray Peat talks about how sucrose from fruits is actually beneficial, because glucose is inhibited with increased lactic acid and free fatty acid production. It actually cannot get into the cell. It's inhibited. So in a sense, he talks about how fructose can kind of bypass this fatty acid inhibition, get into the cell, upfeed the pyruvic acid pathway, utilize oxygen, and produce carbon dioxide. So the fructose not only inhibits insulin by glucose, but it can get into the cell and upregulate cell metabolism while you're in this inflamed state. The next cellular poison is the inhibition of glucose oxidation. Now, the inhibition of glucose oxidation is how our cells are not using, or sugar is not getting in the cell efficiently, which can be glucose and fructose. Increased lipid peroxidation, the increased use of fat for energy, which most people think is actually normal. It's actually an inflammatory state. Or not enough sugar getting into the cell, which is basically, inhibition of glucose oxidation. Now, this can happen from lactic acid, any cellular poison, not enough oxygen, free fatty acids, but of course, unsaturated fats in the diet and in our tissues. The production of carbon dioxide in the cell heavily relies on T3, or thyroid hormone. Now, we know that depends what you read, 70%, 80%, 90% of T3 is actually converted peripherally in the liver. It's dependent, there's two different deodorinase enzymes, but both of them are dependent, or one or the other, are dependent on selenium and glucose to make T3. T4, glucose, deodorinase enzyme, makes T3. Your cells are actually dependent on T3 to make carbon dioxide. Now, according to Philip Young, Dr. Philip Young, lack of glucose in the cell from unsaturated fats, among other things, is the most important factor in decreasing type 1 deodorinase, thus decreasing T3 production, which decreases energy production and increases lactic acid production. Thus, if we decrease the amount of carbohydrates coming in our diet, there's some sort of metabolic burden from lactic acid, free fatty acids, estrogen, or just unsaturated fats, mercury, whatever it may be. Our diet's high in unsaturated fats, low in saturated fats. All of these things block glucose oxidation. We decrease the production of T3 from the liver and the cell's use of T3 in the mitochondria, which decreases the overall vitality and expression of the mitochondria and affects overall energy production. Now, according to Ray Peat, progesterone, sucrose, and T3 are all protective to normal mitochondrial function. And this doesn't mean taking them, this means using the right nutrition, non-inflammatory proteins, carbs, fats, the right ratios, the right grams for your metabolic needs throughout the day to upregulate cell metabolism, to allow the body to autoregulate, to produce these protective hormones to allow for energy production. So before I go any further, hopefully you've enjoyed this. I'm going to cut it off right now, and you can continue with us on part 2 of optimizing respiration.